I never thought the quietest place on my property, the one place dedicated to eternal rest, would become the epicenter of a full-blown war. But that's exactly what happened when Carol Weathers and her obsession with aesthetic uniformity moved into the house next door. My name is Michael, and I own a small but successful landscaping and groundskeeping business. It's work I enjoy, it's tangible, honest, and it lets me be my own boss. More importantly, it allowed me to keep the house I grew up in, the last 5-acre parcel of what was once a 100-acre family farm. My great-great-grandfather built the main house with his own hands. Over the decades, as times changed, my family sold off parcels of land until only our little island of history remained, surrounded by a sea of beige siding and perfectly manicured lawns called Whispering Pines Estates. For the first few years, living next to a homeowners association I wasn't part of was perfectly fine. I kept my property neat, they kept their identical mailboxes in a straight line, and we all coexisted. The original HOA board was a laid-back group of older folks who mostly just organized the annual block party. They understood my property was grandfathered in, an entity separate from their covenants and restrictions. They were our neighbors, not our wardens. Then Carol arrived. She moved into the largest model home, the one bordering my longest fence line. She was a recent retiree from some mid-level corporate management position, and she brought her boardroom bully tactics with her. Within 6 months, she had staged a coup, ousted the old board president, and installed herself as the new queen of Whispering Pines. Her platform was simple: increase property values through aggressive enforcement of the bylaws and the creation of new, more restrictive ones. The first signs of trouble were minor. A passive-aggressive newsletter entry about unneighborly properties with non-standard fencing. A note tucked into my mailbox, not the official one, but my personal one by the door, about the color of my trim not being on the approved community palette. I ignored them. I wasn't in her little kingdom, so her laws didn't apply to me. I was polite when I saw her, offered a simple wave, but made no move to engage. I figured she'd eventually get the hint. I was wrong. Carol didn't take hints. She saw my refusal to comply not as a statement of legal fact, but as a personal challenge. Her focus narrowed from the whole community to my 5 acres of nonconformity. The old barn I used for my business equipment was an eyesore. The mature oak trees that had been there for a century were messy. But her true obsession, the thing that drove her completely over the edge, was the small, stone-walled enclosure at the very back of my property. It was our family cemetery. It held 4 generations of my ancestors, from the original homesteaders to my own grandparents. It was a serene, quiet place, shaded by a massive weeping willow. I kept it immaculately tended, the grass mowed, the headstones clean, the old iron gate free of rust. It was a place of respect and history. To Carol, it was a problem. The confrontation that started it all happened on a Saturday morning. I was weeding the flower beds near the old stone wall when her voice cut through the quiet air like a serrated knife. "You know, that thing is a real blight on this community." I stood up slowly, wiping dirt from my hands onto my jeans. Carol was standing on her side of the fence, dressed in crisp white tennis apparel, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Good morning, Carol," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm not sure what thing you're referring to." "That," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the cemetery. "That morbid little patch of weeds. It's depressing, and it's dragging down the property values for all of us. I've had 3 potential buyers for the Miller house mention it as a negative." I felt a slow burn start in my chest. "That's my family's cemetery, Carol. My grandparents are buried there. It's been here for over 150 years. She waved a dismissive hand. "History is fine, but this is the 21st century. We have standards. The HOA bylaws, Section 9, subsection C, clearly state that all undeveloped common areas must be maintained according to community-approved landscaping plans." I stared at her, genuinely baffled by the sheer audacity. "This isn't a common area. This is my private property. It's not part of the HOA. You know this." "That's a matter of interpretation," she snapped. "From where I'm standing, it looks like a neglected plot of land that directly borders our community. It affects us, therefore it's our business. I'm giving you a chance to be reasonable, Michael. You can either clear it out and convert it into something useful, like a community garden or a gazebo, or you can sign it over to the HOA. We will absorb it into the common area and manage it properly. The idea was so monstrous, so utterly disrespectful, that for a moment I was speechless. Clear it out? She was talking about my family's graves as if they were a pile of last year's leaves. That's not going to happen, I said, my voice dangerously low. This conversation is over. Her face hardened into a mask of righteous fury. Fine, have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. She spun on her heel and marched back toward her pristine, soulless house. The war had begun. True to her word, the official letter arrived a week later. It was from a downtown law firm, printed on heavy, intimidating paper. It cited the same nonsensical bylaw and formally declared the cemetery a nuisance property in violation of community standards. It demanded I submit a remediation plan within 30 days or face a fine of $100 per day. I read it, reread it, and then laughed. It was absurd. They had no jurisdiction. I wrote a simple, polite letter back, explaining that my property was not part of the Whispering Pines HOA and that their bylaws were not applicable. I included a copy of my property survey from when I inherited the place, which clearly showed my 5 acres as a separate, distinct parcel. I sent it via certified mail and figured that would be the end of it. Of course, it wasn't. Carol wasn't interested in facts or legal boundaries. She was interested in winning. The fines started arriving in the mail, weekly invoices for $700, with "past due" stamped in angry red ink. I threw them in a folder and ignored them. Then the campaign of whispers began. Carol started telling people I was running a creepy boneyard and that it was a health hazard. She invented stories about strange smells and nighttime rituals. She had a remarkable talent for making the mundane sound sinister. A few of the newer residents, who didn't know me, started looking at me with suspicion. My waves were met with nervous glances. It started to affect more than just me. Mrs. Gable, a sweet widow in her 80s who lived on the other side of my property, had a small, beautiful garden she'd tended for years. Carol's beautification committee suddenly decided her prize-winning roses weren't on the approved list of flora and ordered her to tear them out. When Mrs. Gable tearfully told me about it, explaining she couldn't afford the fines, I knew I had to do more than just ignore the problem. Carol wasn't just a nuisance, she was a bully who preyed on the vulnerable. The final straw was the notice of lien. It was taped to my front door one morning. The HOA, for non-payment of over $10,000 in bogus fines, was placing a lien on my property. This was no longer just annoying paperwork. This was a direct attack on my home, my business, and my family's legacy. This was an attempt to steal my land. That afternoon, I was in the office of David Chen, a lawyer a friend of mine had recommended. He was a sharp, no-nonsense guy in his late 40s who specialized in property law. He listened patiently as I laid out the whole story, spreading the letters, the fines, and the notice of lien across his polished mahogany desk. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Well, Michael," he said, "the good news is that they are 100% in the wrong. Your property is clearly not part of the HOA. This lien is fraudulent, the fines are baseless, and her demands are laughable from a legal standpoint." I felt a wave of relief. "So, we just send them a letter and it's over?" David's expression turned grim. "The bad news is that people like this don't respond to reason. They respond to force. We can fight this, and we will win, but it will be a process. It will cost you money in legal fees, and it will take time. She's using the HOA's funds to bully you, betting you'll run out of money or patience before she does." "So what do we do?" I asked, the frustration returning. "We fight back, but not just defensively," he said, leaning forward. "We need to find some leverage. We need to turn the tables and make her the one reacting. I'll handle the fraudulent lien immediately. We'll get that thrown out and file a formal complaint. In the meantime, you need to do some digging. Go to the county records office. Pull every single document related to the establishment of the Whispering Pines HOA. The original development plans, the charter, the meeting minutes if they're public. Look for anything. A procedural error, a financial discrepancy, anything that shows they aren't following their own rules. Bullies who are obsessed with rules are often the first to break them when it's convenient. The next day, I took David's advice. I spent hours in the dusty basement of the county courthouse, poring over microfiche and giant bound volumes of property records. I found the original plat maps for the development. Just as I thought, my 5 acres were clearly delineated with a thick black line and labeled, "Not a part of this plat." That was my first piece of ammunition. I then found the land sale agreement between the developer and my uncle, who had sold the surrounding acreage years ago. I read through the dense legal language and found a covenant, a specific clause that had been carried over into the HOA's own founding documents. It stated that the developer, and by extension its successor organization, the HOA, was legally required to not interfere with and to ensure respectful, unimpeded access to the historical cemetery located on the adjacent parcel. It didn't just say they had to leave it alone. It placed an active duty on them to respect it. This was better. This showed they were violating their own charter. But I still felt like I was missing the knockout punch. Carol would just argue that her interpretation of respectful meant turning it into a park. I kept digging, driven by a cold anger. I started researching the history of the area, not just my family's, but the town's. I went to the local library, sifting through historical archives and old newspapers. And that's when I found it. My great-great-grandfather, the man who built my house, wasn't just a farmer. He was one of the 3 founders of the original township back in the 1870s. He'd served as its first judge. And according to an article from 1902, the small cemetery on his property wasn't just for our family. It was the original burial ground for the town's founders, including a decorated Civil War veteran and the town's first school teacher. It wasn't just a family plot. It was a site of significant local history. My heart started pounding. I suddenly remembered my grandmother telling me stories about it, but as a kid, I'd never grasped the full significance. This changed everything. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to my lawyer, but to the State Historical Society. I explained the situation, what the cemetery was, and what the HOA was trying to do. The polite, academic tone of the man on the other end of the line shifted dramatically. He became sharp, focused, and deeply concerned. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice now steel, "what you're describing is a potential violation of state historical preservation laws. Attempting to seize, alter, or desecrate a registered or eligible historical burial ground is a serious offense. Can you send me everything you have? The records, the letters from the HOA, your photographs?" I sent him a thick package of documents overnight. He called me back 2 days later. "It's as you thought," he said. "The site is eligible for the State Register of Historic Places. In fact, based on our preliminary research, it's a shoo-in. We are fast-tracking the application. But more importantly, its status as a pioneer cemetery gives it automatic protections under State Statute 157.70. I've already spoken with the Attorney General's office. They are very interested." I felt a grin spread across my face for the first time in months. The tables were turning. David, my lawyer, was ecstatic when I told him. "This is it, Michael," he said. "This is the canon we needed. Now, we don't just react, we choose the time and place of the battle." The perfect opportunity presented itself a week later. Carol, emboldened by my lack of response to the lien, called a special meeting of the HOA. The agenda, according to the notice posted in the community clubhouse, was to vote on a special assessment to fund legal action for the acquisition and beautification of the adjacent, blighted common area. She was asking the entire neighborhood to pay for her personal war against me. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting were there. Carol had clearly whipped many of them into a frenzy about property values, but I could also see friendly, worried faces in the crowd. People like Mrs. Gable, who looked terrified but had come to support me. I didn't go alone. I walked in with David at my side, and a few steps behind us was Mr. Abernathy, a distinguished, silver-haired gentleman from the State Historical Society, carrying a thick leather briefcase. We took seats in the back and waited. Carol, standing at a podium at the front of the room, beamed with self-importance. She launched into a passionate 15-minute speech about her vision for a unified, pristine community. She painted me as a stubborn, uncooperative recluse who was single-handedly holding the neighborhood back from its full potential. She called the cemetery a disgusting and spooky wasteland that was a lawsuit waiting to happen. "This man refuses to see reason," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "He leaves us no choice but to use the power of our covenants to protect our investment. The special assessment is a mere $50 per household, a small price to pay to finally resolve this issue and turn that eyesore into a beautiful park for our children." When she finished, there was a smattering of applause from her cronies on the board. She then opened the floor for discussion, a smug look on her face, certain of her victory. That was our cue. I stood up. "I'd like to address the members, if I may." Carol's eyes narrowed. "You are not a member of this association, Michael. You have no right to speak here." "Actually," David said, standing beside me, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the murmurs in the room, "since the sole purpose of this meeting is to raise funds to sue my client, he has every right to be heard, as does his associate." Before Carol could object, I walked to the front of the room. I didn't stand at the podium, I stood on the floor, on the same level as my neighbors. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. "My name is Michael Miller," I began. "My family has lived on this land for over 160 years. I know many of you, and many of you know me. You know I keep to myself, but I've always tried to be a good neighbor. What your president, Carol, has just told you is not the truth." I paused, letting that sink in. "First," I said, holding up the certified plat map I'd gotten from the county, "my property is not, and has never been, part of the Whispering Pines HOA. This is the official map filed with the county. Her fines, her lien, and this entire legal action are based on a fantasy. She has no jurisdiction over my land. None." A wave of whispers swept through the room. I saw people turning to look at the board members, their expressions shifting from support to confusion. "Second," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "the blighted area she wants you to pay to seize isn't just my family's cemetery. It's a pioneer cemetery. It's the final resting place of the founders of this very town. It is a site of historical significance." I then turned and gestured to Mr. Abernathy, who had walked quietly to the front. "This is Mr. Abernathy from the State Historical Society. He'd like to say a few words." Abernathy opened his briefcase and took out a stack of papers. He didn't need the podium either. His voice was quiet, but carried an immense weight of authority. "Good evening. As has been stated, the Miller Cemetery is a protected historical site under State Statute 157.70. We have completed our review, and it has been officially accepted to the State Register of Historic Places. I have the documentation right here." He held up a certificate with a gold seal. "I want to be perfectly clear with all of you. Any attempt to alter, seize, or desecrate this site is a state-level offense. The penalties include fines of up to $50,000 and potential felony charges for the individuals responsible. That means the board members who vote for such an action." A collective gasp went through the room. The board members sitting next to Carol looked like they had seen a ghost. One of them, a man named Henderson, went pale and started sweating. Abernathy wasn't finished. He looked directly at Carol. "Furthermore, the State Attorney General's office has been notified of this HOA's campaign of harassment, the filing of a fraudulent lien, and the misuse of HOA funds to pursue a personal vendetta against a private landowner. They have opened an investigation." The room was dead silent now. Carol's face had gone from smug to crimson to a sickly mottled white. She stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. David stepped forward for the final blow. "And just so everyone is aware," he said, his voice ringing with legal precision, We will be filing a civil suit against the Whispering Pines HOA and its board members individually for harassment and damages. We will also be filing a complaint with the state bar against your legal counsel for knowingly participating in the filing of a fraudulent property lien. It was over. The collapse was total and immediate. People started shouting questions at the board. Henderson, the treasurer, stood up and said, "I had no idea about this. I was told it was a simple compliance issue." Another board member resigned on the spot. Carol finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, sputtering rage. "This is ridiculous. I was following the bylaws. I was protecting our property values." But no one was listening. Her authority had evaporated in the space of 10 minutes. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the clubhouse, followed by the glares of every person in the room. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The state's investigation into the HOA's finances uncovered more than just the vendetta against me. It turned out, Carol had been giving a no-bid, exclusive contract for all of the community's landscaping to a company owned by her brother, at a 30% markup over standard rates. She was embezzling funds, plain and simple. Faced with incontrovertible evidence, she pleaded guilty to fraud and embezzlement to avoid a lengthy trial. She received a sentence of 5 years probation, was ordered to pay over $80,000 in restitution to the HOA, and was legally barred from ever serving on any board or committee again. The court-ordered sale of her house barely covered the restitution and her own legal fees. My lawsuit was settled quickly. The HOA's insurance paid for all my legal costs and a handsome sum for damages. I kept enough to cover my time and stress, and I donated the rest to the State Historical Society's Cemetery Preservation Fund. The fraudulent lien was expunged from my record, and I received a formal, written apology from the new, interim HOA board. The community itself went through a reformation. The old board was completely dissolved. The residents, now thoroughly awakened to the dangers of unchecked power, elected a new board of sensible, community-minded people. Mrs. Gable, to everyone's delight, was unanimously elected as the new president. The first thing she did was lead a vote to rewrite the bylaws, adding clauses to promote transparency and prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. Whispering Pines actually became a whisper-quiet, pleasant place to live. A couple of years passed. Life returned to a peaceful rhythm. My business grew, as many of my neighbors, now my friends, became my best clients. The story of the battle for the cemetery became a local legend, a cautionary tale about petty tyrants. One day, I was in the local grocery store looking at tomatoes when I saw her. It was Carol. She looked smaller, diminished. The crisp, commanding posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. Her expensive tennis clothes were replaced by a faded tracksuit. She saw me, and for a second, her eyes widened in panic. She quickly looked away, pushing her cart down another aisle, her head bowed in shame. There was no confrontation, no final words. There was nothing left to say. Her own actions had been her undoing. I think about it sometimes, usually when I'm back in the cemetery, trimming the grass around the old headstones. It's a quiet, peaceful place again. This little patch of earth is a testament to the idea that some things are more important than manicured lawns and uniform paint colors. It's about history, respect, and the simple right to be left alone. Carol thought rules were weapons to be used to force the world into her own narrow image. What she failed to understand is that true community isn't about control, it's about cooperation. It's not about enforcing arbitrary standards, it's about respecting your neighbors. She learned that lesson the hard way. And now, thanks to her, my family's resting place is protected forever. A quiet, permanent monument to the fact that bullies, no matter how loud they are, can't win against the simple, stubborn truth.